Would you spend $100 on a single fishing lure? How about $300? How about $500? Now, this probably sounds like crazy talk to a lot of you, yet the custom swim bait and glide bait markets continue to grow in the U.S. year over year. These giant handmade lures are popular for largemouth bass, muskies, and several saltwater species, but the real question is this all vanity? Do people that spend this kind of coin on a bait do it to show off, or does an investment in a custom-made lure that costs more than the average monthly car payment actually catch you more fish? That's what we're going to find out this week. I'm Outdoor Life Fishing Editor Joe Cermele, and this is the Quick Strike Podcast. Joining me this week is Dennis Perko. Now, he's a full-time lure maker based in Virginia. And while he makes a variety of bait styles, what those in the muskie, striper, and bass games want most are his large glide baits. Now, while the general swim bait category of lures continues to grow in popularity, the glide bait subcategory is growing extra fast, and these baits are very, very trendy right now. So we're going to explain what they are and what they do, but I will admit that just this past fishing season, I drank the glide bait Kool-Aid myself and have really grown to enjoy fishing them. The thing is, not all glide baits are created equal, okay? Make no mistake, you can walk into any Bass Pro Shop today and grab a glide bait off the pegboard, and you'd still have plenty of cash left over for that car payment. But once you understand the subtle differences between mass-produced glide baits and swim baits and what goes into Dennis's baits, it becomes hard to deny that these prices are not only kind of justified, but in many cases, you are in fact going to catch more and bigger fish on a custom glide bait than one of the ones pumped out in a factory overseas. Fair warning, if this episode gets your wheels turning about the damage you could do on your home waters with a good custom, start doing extra chores, because you will need some extra allowance money. So, Dennis, tell me how much the most expensive bait that you make under the Perko Lures flag costs.
It's $550.
Right. And now that's a glide bait, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
But you make all different styles of lures, glide baits, swim baits, and all these styles in general on the custom side fetch pretty high prices.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what's the most common reaction when you tell somebody who maybe doesn't understand this scene or understand the benefits of lures made with the precision you make them with, when you tell them that you sell a lure that costs $500?
Well, generally speaking, when I mention price, people are pretty. I guess they're not. I don't want to say that they don't understand it, but they just generally go, yeah, that's out of my price range.
Sure.
Like I can't. It's like I see it, but I can't afford it.
But do they see it, or do you get a lot of like, that's just a ridiculous number to spend on something you're going to cast into a lake?
Oh yeah, for sure. And it depends, I think, on the clientele, right? So I'm maybe not lake guys necessarily, but saltwater guys, I get that reaction a lot.
Sure.
Because they're like, I'm not risking that to something that could easily get cut off by, a bluefish or, something toothy.
Right. Which is completely understandable.
Yeah.
But I mean, the point that we're trying to drive home here in talking is that, that is a very common reaction. I've posted lures, yours and other people's, and, have mentioned that these things are worth hundreds of dollars. And it's very common to get the reaction of like, well, that's just ridiculous. Why like that? It makes no sense to certain people. And I think what comes with that is a perception from people who maybe don't understand the custom lure scene the way you and I do, is that it's just vanity. In other words, you would only spend this kind of money on a bait because you're a rich kid, or because you have it, or because you want to be flashy. And I've noticed a common reaction where people just insist that there's no reason to have that. In other words, there's nothing I can't buy at Bass Pro or Dick's Sporting Goods or wherever that won't do what that $500 lure does. And I'm certainly not. So you'd agree, this is not a game for everybody.
Oh, it is. No, absolutely not.
And I don't think in this we're trying to suggest that the answer to all your fishless problems are going out and spending $500 on a lure.
Yeah, no.
But I do think it's important for people to understand what those benefits are. So, in your own words, man, like explain to me in a nutshell what you can offer by making lures with the precision and care that you do that, mass production just falls short on? Because I do understand that there's also just an element of art involved here.
Yeah.
And you pay more for one-of-a-kinds and things made by local artists versus mass-produced. But from a performance perspective, how do you explain that to people?
Generally, like when I look at mass-produced baits, the swim is something that it just seems to fall short.
Sure.
Like keeping a bait balanced, even like to the point where you're factoring are you using a leader? Like I'll ask some of my guys, like, are you fishing muskies with this bait?
Sure.
Or are you bass fishing? Because if you're going leaderless, I'll weight it a little bit differently. Right. So it swims without a steel leader on the front. So, I mean, it's just that level of customization that you're getting.
Sure.
Because we're working back and forth, and I'm doing my best to make you a bait that is going to do what it is you're after.
Right.
And you're not going to get that off the shelf. Like you're working with someone to have them create something for you, for your experience.
Right. And you started out working in wood, right? And now you work in resin. And I know historically, if you look back, like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one thing that's very coveted with old lures, with vintage lures, particularly like in the bass crankbait scene as an example, like the old Bagleys and Big O's and things like that.
Yeah.
People crave, collectors crave, and even fishermen, they still want to fish them. They want the ones that were carved out of wood before those lures inevitably went to mass production. Because, at one point they're all being whittled and carved by hand in I believe it was Tennessee they started, or Arkansas, one of those states down there. But those are the ones that everybody wants. And what I've heard is that with wood, actually one of the benefits is sort of the inability for hand-carved plugs to be identical copies of each other. So this one that you get might swim a little bit differently than the next one. And it's almost like, to a fault, once you start mass producing and making molds and pumping these things out, that's sort of what you lose in wood lures, is that sort of personal touch and sort of human error in a way. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And for me, that's kind of the point. When I started working with wood baits, it gets to where there's so much work going into trying to put one or put two together that swim the same way. Right. And then you're messing around with, internal weighting and trying to figure it all out to try and get those two to swim. Like, let's say one guy orders two baits, and I'm trying to make both of those baits swim the same because I'm sending them to the same customer. That gets tricky. Yeah. So ultimately, that's where I ended up going with the resin, because it's more. I have more control over a large number of baits.
Sure. Yeah. Now, wooden lures, right? Custom wooden lures. That's been a thing forever in so many scenes: the musky world, the striped bass world, the largemouth world. But now, tell me a little bit about how we've gotten to resin, because now if you look at a lot of custom lure makers like yourself, that is where they're going, now to resin material, which, has its own fickleness to it that you have to deal with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the temperature, the humidity of the room where you're working, those are all very big factors in what you end up producing. And so you have to monitor the place where you're working to be able to get those baits to be identical every time. Because if you're working on a high humidity day, you're going to get, a bait that has more air bubbles in it. It's going to float higher in the water, and it's not going to swim as much as one that you poured on, say, a low humidity day. And it's because the resin reacts with the humidity in the air.
Yeah. Now, a lot of what people are paying for in these custom baits, particularly in with glide baits, swim baits, things like that. You mentioned buoyancy being an extremely important factor that maybe people wouldn't think about with commercially bought or plastic lures. But a lot of it is that attention to detail to make the lure sink as fast or slow as you want it to. Because with a lot of these baits, you want them to sink slowly so they sort of hover in place and they can be finessed and tease up a large fish.
Yep.
And that's sort of the thing that I've, as I understand it, because all these styles of lures, swim baits and glide baits for that matter, they are mass produced. There are plenty of companies out there that make plastic glide baits and in factories overseas, they churn them out. Yeah. But it's those sort of minute details that on a grand scale of production are very hard to replicate, right?
Yeah. So the guys that are working with like ABS plastics, the injection molded baits, so they have somewhat of an advantage on their baits in that they are trapping air into their baits, which is the most buoyant thing that you're going to get. Right?
Sure.
And so when you're working with resin, it's hard to kind of match that amount of buoyancy they're getting. Also wood, right? Wood is way more buoyant than resin.
Right.
Way more buoyant.
Right.
And you could make a pretty amazing bait out of wood if you could get all of your wood to be exactly the same as far as its density and,
sure.
But like a knot, like if you have a knot in your piece of wood, it's going to cause a variant in there that one is probably, it's more dense than that knot. So it's going to sink just that much slower. And you think that it would not matter, but it really does, to the point where like a 1/10 of a gram can be the difference between floating and sinking.
Right.
And it's very, you have to really dial that type of stuff in.
Yeah. Yeah. And resin in particular, give us a little bit of the insight into how you make these baits, because I know, we see so much now. I think it's also worth pointing out, right? And this is a little bit of a shot, but I mean, it's fair. A lot of us were on social media, and it's not uncommon. You're seeing tons of custom baits. There are many great lure makers across the country. But again, to your point, like what you do isn't about looks. Your baits look beautiful, but at the end, you don't earn a reputation by looks.
No.
So everything comes down to performance.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I will start designing a bait that I think looks as good as possible, but if I can't get it to swim the way I want it to, I would never market it. So before I'll even paint the first one, I will pour 15 or 20 with different weighting options as far as how much lead is inside of them. And I will dial it in until that bait is exactly what I want to do. And I take notes on everything. Everything gets written down because, you do it 20 times.
Sure.
You're trying to remember which one is which.
Yeah.
And that's hard. So you write it all down, and I will number the blanks as I'm like working on them. I write on them with a Sharpie. And so as I'm casting it, I'm like, okay, number 12 worked. What did I do on number 12?
Right.
And I'll go back and I'll try and do that again. And if I can keep replicating baits that are all swimming exactly the same, I know I got it in.
Yeah.
Sometimes that doesn't work, right? Like I go back and I'm like, what do I do on 12? And I try and do it again. And trying to replicate number 12 didn't work. I'm like, okay, what did I do differently?
Yeah.
To try and get it. And so there's a ton I have notebooks full of like my formulas on how to get it right.
Right. And I'm just curious, man, like what's the longest it's ever taken you to refine one to where it was ready to go?
Well, I think because I've been doing this it'll be 3 years here coming up. Early on, it was I had more of a learning curve because I didn't understand as much of what I was doing.
Sure.
So it took, to get my grid search, the 4-piece swim bait that I make, to get the swim on that dialed in took me 6 months because I was trying to put lead like spaced out in the bait, and I didn't realize how that was negatively affecting the bait on how it swam. And then also like as far as like the joints, right? Like a half a turn of the screws in those joints is enough to make it swim right or wrong. And so like I would take the bait back apart, loosen the joint up a half a turn on the screws, put it back together, and then go see what happened. And then it turns out that like on mine, the joints are not all the same, right? So I had to write down how many, how far apart the head and the body and then the third and fourth pieces are supposed to be apart.
Yeah.
So it with 4 joints, I think that was one of the hardest things. And then when I went into glides, I really didn't understand. I didn't understand how glides worked, right?
Yeah.
And so trying to get that dialed in was hard.
Well, and glide baits are something I've gotten very into. And just to sort of explain that to people who are unfamiliar with it, glide baits, I know from things that I've written in the past that there's kind of a hazy history on like the true origin of glide baits. Some people say it goes all the way back into the early 1900s with some certain lures, but really, I think that the attribution goes to some of the Japanese lure makers in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And, you had these large hard plastic swim baits that had diving lips. Everybody understands a diving lip like on a crankbait or a jerk bait that takes it down. And the bass in Japan were so pressured, right? There's so much traffic on these bass lakes in Japan that anglers there were just looking for some sort of edge to outsmart these fish. And what I've read is that these guys started ripping the lips off of some of these large swim baits. I mean, these are lures that some of them can be, 12 inches long. What's your biggest one?
My big one is 16 inches and weighs 23 and a quarter ounces.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, these are not the kind of lures you're going to just throw on your 8-pound test spinning rod. It is sort of a more dialed in specialty deal. But these Japanese anglers would start taking the lips off and then sealing up that hole and weighting them so that these glide baits just sort of hovered just under the surface, and with one turn of the handle, it took very little effort to just make them stroke and glide from side to side. And the impression they give fish, it's sort of, I've heard you say it looks like a happy fish. In other words, it's not on guard. It's just sort of
he's just out
looking
cruising.
dumb and being out there cruising around. And it turns out that that kind of action in these larger baits really appealed to the highest caliber fish in these highly pressured bodies of water.
Yeah.
And both glide baits, swim baits, a lot of the things that you make and other guys make, that has really carried over to the U.S. here. I mean, it's no secret that some of our best waters are extremely pressured. So the appeal, fair to say, is that, I mean, it sort of stems from the idea of looking for an edge to fool the oldest, wisest, smartest fish within any given body of water.
Yeah, and I guess it seems to me like the smaller fish are more like opportunistic to fleeing, like a fleeing fish. So you're used to working like jerk baits and crankbaits. They're working fast, and so these smaller fish are opportunistic. They see this fleeing fish and they go after it.
Yeah.
Whereas like these big fish are targeting just a bait fish that's out cruising.
Right.
He just, for whatever reason, that one's cruising there on the surface and he has no idea that I'm even here.
Right.
And the big fish seem to like really key in on that.
We'll be right back after this short break. Dennis and I have talked about this in the past, just yucking it up. I've gotten very into glide baits recently. I'm certainly no expert. I have a couple of them, but I had posted something on my Instagram account, and somebody made they made a comment about it being this $150 lure, and they're like, well, that's crazy. Like, does that really catch more fish than a $10 lure that you buy at the store? And my answer was, well, yes, sometimes, but I think it was too short of an answer because the guy kind of started giving me a hard time. But what I was trying to capture in that answer was exactly what we're talking about here. It may seem crazy to many anglers to spend that kind of money on a single lure, but if you understand what goes into them and what really makes them stand out, how they behave in the water, yes, there are quite often many times when a lure worth that much money is so finely tuned by somebody like you that it does, in fact, outproduce anything else you're going to throw, or at least in terms of big fish, right?
Yeah.
But I also think it's fair to say that when you look at a lot of this custom stuff, it is solely associated with trophy fish, when what I've seen, and I wonder if you've seen the same thing, is even more average size fish. I mean, some of these lures present what just looks like such a dumb, for lack of a better way to put it, easy target that it appeals to. It's sort of like not like like you're excluding everything else in the lake. In other words, if something comes up and eats this, it's only going to be a 10-pound largemouth. That's not really true.
No, not at all. And actually, I haven't actually landed a muskie on my big glide yet, and I designed it to target, the big guys, the 50-inch, 50-plus inch muskie.
Yeah.
But because I've been muskie fishing long enough now, I just know that the first one that I get on it is going to be a 36-incher.
Right.
A run-of-the-mill mediocre muskie is going to come take a shot at this giant glide.
Yeah.
And it's just because it does present that big, slow, easy target.
Yeah.
And at that time when you're fishing those baits, that's what all the muskies are looking for. And, they just have mouths bigger than their eyes.
Sure. Well, like we said, performance is what matters. The bait can look great, but it has to perform. So I know you're always hungry for, shots and things of your lures hanging out of fish's mouths all over the place.
Every maker.
What's the one that stands out the most to you that you maybe got from a customer?
Well, I've got a buddy of mine, my buddy Lewis. He got like a 7-pound largemouth on a grid search early on.
Yeah.
And it was, I think, the first largemouth that had been caught on one of my baits.
Yeah.
And so that was pretty awesome. A guide buddy of mine, he's always sending me big muskie pictures because he throws my stuff. And and so like those are, I guess I can't say necessarily there's one in particular because it's like it's just always great.
Sure.
And we can never get enough of them.
Sure.
But like that's always what we're after.
So let me ask you this as a lure maker, right? So let's say that, somebody listening says, okay, I'm going to put some, some of my allowance money or whatever it may be aside.
Sure.
And I'm going to go all in. I'm going to buy one of these baits. I want to see what it's all about, right? So obviously now they know you, but if you're just sort of kicking around the internet or social media and looking at custom lures, is there anything you can look out for that might turn you off just by looks alone? In other words, how do you stop somebody from spending too much on a lure that won't perform? What do you need to see to know this one is worth this money?
Before you buy a custom bait, anybody that I think is worth their salt is going to have swim videos, right? Like, because if you're not shooting a video of your bait swimming, there's really no proof that what you're doing works.
Sure.
And so, I don't record a whole lot of them,
right?
But I do have videos on hand because like every time.
So if somebody asks, you can produce it.
When people message me about a bait, they're like, "Hey, I love the look of this bait. Do you have a video of it swimming? I want to see what it can do." Like with different reel retrieves, right? So whether you're trying to get that real slow wide glide or if you want to burn it and it swims in, that's another thing. Like that's one of the marks of like, say, a good glide is that you can reel it as fast as you want and it's not going to blow out to the side or, come up to the surface or whatever.
Because sometimes these lures are so large and they have, one hinge in the middle that I've even seen that if you reel too fast, they just get wonky and now they're not doing anything.
Right.
So that's a great point there, is to look for the ones that perform at any speed.
Yeah. Well, just, you want to versatile. I mean, not all of my baits are as versatile as I would want. Right.
Yeah.
But some of them are designed to be fished slower.
Right.
Whereas like the pickpocket, right. It can be fished. If you want to chop it real hard, if you want to, burn it, if you want to fish it real slow, whatever you want to do, it can do all of those things. So it just kind of, as it comes back to the angler, what are you looking for in a bait? If you're like, hey, I'm fishing dead water, I want a bait that is, I don't need to be able to fish it fast. Okay, I make a bait that can't be fished fast.
Right.
That's perfect. But if you're fishing in let's say, I send a lot of these to guys that are fishing tidal water and they've got a lot of current. The pickpocket can handle that side current, which is a hard thing to do for a bait maker, is to make a bait that handles current because it tends to blow out baits.
Sure.
And so you need to make things. And I've had guys that are like, I love that bait, but I'm fishing ripping current. Can you put more lead in it? I need it to sink faster. And let me mess around with it.
Yeah.
So I went around and I made baits that have 3-4 times the amount of lead that I normally put in a bait. And I had to figure out how to get it all in there. But I'm sending it to these guys in Tennessee that are fishing just ripping current, and the bait is performing, but it's performing 6-8 feet down because that's where their fish are striking. And
I mean, and this is, an element of what you're paying for that I don't think enough people at face value understand. To them, it is just like, this is a lure. This is a fishing lure. But again, it's the difference between, I don't know, going to IKEA for your furniture or having a custom furniture maker make you your perfect dining room table.
Yeah.
And most of the lure makers I know, yourself included, it's sort of one of these deals where, well, if something goes wrong or you don't like something, send that bait back. I'll tweak it for you.
Or make you another one.
It's sort of like a commitment, with smaller lure makers. Once you're willing to spend that kind of money, I imagine like you have relationships with most of your regular customers.
Some of my customers have become my best friends.
Yeah.
And I mean, a case in point, just recently I had a guy, I sent him one of my 6.5-inch grid searches, and I don't know what happened. He was fishing at night. He made a cast and he must have hit a rock or something. I don't know what happened, but he had literally got the bait that morning. And he sent me a picture of it, and the fourth section had broken off. Mm-hmm. And he's like, "Dude, I don't know what happened."
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's rough. I was like, you know what? Send it back to me, and I'll fix it, and I'm gonna make you another one.
Right.
Like I don't know what happened on yours, but mail it back to me. I'll make a new section. I'll paint it, match it up, but I'm gonna make you another one that matches that, and I'm gonna send you both of them back.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to say that all bait makers are like that. Like
sure.
they may not do that. But there is that relationship. I mean, also this guy has ordered, 20, 30 baits from me this year. Mm-hmm. So, it doesn't hurt me that badly to keep that guy and send him necessarily a free bait and repair his bait.
Right.
To keep that relationship.
Right.
Because I've got a good customer, and there's like, when it comes to this business or any business, I suppose, word of mouth and your reputation is really all you've got.
Sure.
So, I try and do everything I can to make everything right if something happens.
Yeah. And again, I mean, that's what people need to understand is that like the baits you make, you can personally tailor those to your need, the angler's needs, which is something that mass production just can't really do. Much beyond color and whatever action comes out of the package, they can't be specifically tailored to your fishery. But let's say you have somebody who's not that dialed. In other words, they don't know what they need yet. They don't understand that level of minutia.
Sure.
If you had to recommend sort of a weight or action, if somebody was going to pony up the money and go, I'm going to try one of these things. I'm going to throw down the money at Perco. I don't know what I'm doing. I've never fished these giant custom lures before. What do you tell people? What do they want?
Well, because I've been doing this for a while and I've got the relationships with the different guys that are fishing for stripers, guys that are fishing for muskies, guys that are fishing for bass. That's kind of my first question. Like, what are you fishing for?
Yeah.
Right? Because that's going to start narrowing things down. And then it's like, well, okay, what type of bodies of water are you typically fishing? Are you fishing rivers? Are you fishing lakes? And it gets into like, what is the forage, right? Do you have a lake with alewives? Are the bass feeding on crappies? What's going on? Like,
sure.
Tell me your fishing situation and we can start working on things that are going to work.
Yeah.
And then, it's always funny because people message me and they're like, hey, what paint jobs do you offer?
Right.
And I'm like, I don't think you really understand.
Sure.
Like,
because that's what we do. We look at cosmetics. That's
right.
what anglers do. Yeah.
Right. Like, you're looking at the Rapala line, you're looking at whatever lines of these baits, and there's only so many paint jobs that these companies offer.
Right.
I'm like, I don't know. What do you want?
Right.
Like,
right. Sure.
if you want it bright, if you want a bright pink and chartreuse crappie bait, like I will paint it. I will make it look like a crappie, but it'll be neon.
Right.
So they want like a catalog from me on my, like what my paint jobs are.
Right.
And that just can't happen.
Doesn't exist.
Because I don't know, like I'll send you pictures of what I've done.
Right. So fair to say that if you are going to spend this kind of money and approach a bait maker and he or she is not asking you these questions, that's a red flag.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. Especially if you're trying to get a true custom.
Right.
Right. There's a possibility, like if you've got a seasoned angler who comes to you and like they'll like these Northeast striper guys come to me and they're like, hey, I'm looking for a bait to fish out in these flats and I want it to look like a bunker.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, sweet. I've already got, like, I know that I have enough of those clients that I make those baits and hang them on the wall.
Yeah.
So I have like bunkered paint jobs in all my different baits ready to go because I know what works for those guys. So it's not necessarily a red flag that you're not asking, because sometimes like the fisherman comes and says they know what they want. I want a bunker paint job and I want it in a glide.
Right.
Okay. Like those clients, they know what they want. But if you don't know what you want and you come to a bait maker and he doesn't ask you what you want or like how to work with you, yeah, it's probably not the best.
Right.
Because this is someone who doesn't really care about what they're sending you. At least it would seem that way.
Right.
Because they're just trying to get their baits out.
Yeah.
And I get that, right? Like it's a hard business to be in, but you want to build these relationships and really try and make your bait stand out amongst the rest.
And fair to say that with the right guy and you asking the right questions and the bait maker asking the right questions, I mean, this really could be your ticket to a secret weapon on your body of water that nobody else is going to have and that will outfish the average angler.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, I got a customer of mine in Maine. He swore that like these bass were only eating these black crappies. And he's like, and I can't get the right paint job. I can't get it to look right in any of these other baits. So I made him a pickpocket in a black crappie. And like the day he got it, he was sending me like 6-pound largemouth that he was getting up in Maine. And now he ordered the 5.5 version and he's going to get the 7 here as soon as I get it released. But he could not get him to do. And also like, I offer hooks on baits, but he was like, I don't send the hooks that you have. I want to put smaller hooks on it because these fish are so like pressured that the hooks that you have on there are going to like spook them. And I was like, I mean, I don't necessarily believe that, but this is your body of water.
Yeah.
So if you don't want it with hooks, put small hooks on it, like make it work for you.
Yeah.
And so with the smaller hooks, it doesn't sink quite as fast. And he ended up having to put like lead tape on the bottom to dial in his own swim, which is a thing that like real like customers, guys that really get into the swim bait, glide bait world,
sure,
they want to tune their baits,
right?
Like they want a bait that like is close, but they want to get in and put like nose weights and get it like dial it themselves.
And fair warning, this is an addicting thing. Usually, once you open this can of worms, you suddenly want an arsenal of these baits. But I think, just for the dreamers out there, think about that muskie that you witnessed eat a yellow perch, or come up and the bass you saw eat a trout on your home lake. If nothing else, if you call a guy like Dennis, he can make you that exactly, and you might catch that fish.
Yeah, for sure.
If you are ready to dive into the expensive yet very often rewarding world of custom glide baits and swim baits, you can find Dennis on Instagram at Perko Lures, Perko. He makes some terrific baits, works very hard, and as you just learned, cares about the details and will work with you to create a custom secret weapon for your home lake or river. And all I can say is don't knock it until you've tried it, because I knocked it for a while and then I tried it and now I'm kind of addicted to it. Final tip, do make sure you can tie really strong knots if you're going to use these expensive customs. And if you want to know which knots I use to secure my glide baits, you can reach me at quickstrikepodcast@gmail.com. If you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear covered on Quick Strike, please send them along to that email address as well. You can follow me on Instagram at Joe Cermele138. Thanks, as always, to engineer Mike Pederson of 85 Audio for making this show sound so very nice. And if you want to hear more from me, join me on my weekly long-form show, Cut and Retie, anywhere you get your podcast.